Hello. A lighter video this time around. I've seen this TED Ed video floating around that puts Guevara on trial. To their credit, they've done a fairly decent job of being balanced. That being, the side quote-unquote defending Guevara being just factual, and the side against Guevara just repeating tired tropes and misinformation debunked 100 times over. Still, there's a few things to comment on, so let's jump right in.
Ahem. Your Honor, this is Ernesto Che Guevara. In the early 1950s, he left behind a privileged life as a medical student in Argentina to travel through rural Latin America. The poverty and misery he witnessed convinced him that saving lives required more than medicine.
True. Being a physician myself, it's painfully obvious that actually helping people is a national state endeavor that requires all of society's participation. You can't medicate away systemic poverty nor the consequences of that poverty. Without an established system that makes sure all are fed, housed, educated, and employed, all you're doing is slapping a band-aid onto a sinking ship. Guevara's own motorcycle diary shares some of his amazing insights into the world he saw, and you can't help but understand why he became a Marxist as a result. A highly recommended read.
So he became a terrorist seeking to violently overthrow the region's governments.
That's very rich, as all the countries of the region had incredibly vibrant and active left-wing and guerrilla movements that were ruthlessly crushed, with the CIA's blessing, of course. I don't think it's particularly difficult to question the legitimacy of a US-backed dictatorship, with absolutely no popular support aside from those closest to the very center of power, usually the dictator, his family, and the army. Also, to describe Guevara with that word is to basically tear all meaning out of it. The biggest sponsor of the T-World worldwide is the US, which has armed more dictatorships and reactionary movements, rigged more elections, overthrown more democratically elected nations, and installed more dictators than any other country in history by a terrifying margin. I recommend these books nearly every video now, but read Killing Hope and The Triumph of Evil.
What? The region's governments were brutal oligarchies. Colonialism may have formally ended, but elites still controlled all the wealth. American corporations bought up land originally seized from indigenous people and used it for profit and export, even keeping most of it uncultivated, while locals starved. Couldn't they vote to change that? Oh, they tried, Your Honor. In 1953, Che came to Guatemala under the democratically elected government of President Arbenz. Arbenz passed reforms to redistribute some of this uncultivated land back to the people while compensating the landowners. But he was overthrown in a CIA-sponsored coup.
I don't know who wrote the script for the lawyer here, but I definitely want to be their friend. Everything they said was right. In fact, he wasn't explicit enough. Arbenz, like Allende, did everything right. He came to power democratically. He promised not to be too radical. He not only left the capitalists and American lackeys alone, but actively protected them. He waited for indirect permission from the US to do nearly anything, and made sure to be as transparent as possible with all his moves, and he still was viciously overthrown for daring to care about the poor and indigenous of his country. His story is basically an exact guide of what not to do in relation to the US when it comes to radical politics. Bitter Fruit by Stefan Schlesinger is a great read on this.
The military was protecting against the seizure of private property and communist takeover.
This is literally like talking to any read Econ 101 bro type people. Again, questioning the legitimacy of quote-unquote private property is equally valid when that land was literally stolen from indigenous people or bought out through shady practices. Furthermore, and this is the insane part, the landowners were compensated. The only thing they should be compensated with is a preventing communist takeover. Is always funny to me because what if that's the democratic will of the population? Genuinely, this is a question that these people go mask off about, like that demon Kissinger who said, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. These issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." The same case for Greece, Italy, France, Korea, practically all of Latin America, dozens of countries in Africa, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, etc., etc.
They were protecting corporate profits. And Che saw that they would use the fear of communism to overthrow any government that threatened those profits. So he took the lessons of Guatemala with him to Mexico. There he met exiled Cuban revolutionaries.
Correct, but slightly oversimplified. I find the omittance of Guevara going to prison in Guatemala strange, but otherwise exactly right. He also was briefly in a Mexican prison with Castro too, which provided a wide array of shirtless Guevara pictures for those interested.
And decided to help them liberate their country. You mean help Fidel Castro turn a vibrant Cuba into a dictatorship?
God, what an absolute dork. You can hear it in the guy's stupid voice. Actually, just be quiet. Firstly, the Cuban system of governance is far more democratic and inclusive than the US, for example. You can check out the book Cuba and Its Neighbors, Democracy in Motion by Arnold August for more on that. Secondly, Cuba already was a dictatorship, jackass. Just one friendly to US interests, though. It was practically a US colony, hence they didn't care. Mark my words, if God forbid Cuba ever falls to reaction, it will be turned right back into that, a CIA, mafia-run prostitution, gambling, and crippling poverty joint for wealthy white American tourists.
Dictatorship was what Cuba had before the revolution. Fulgencio Batista was a tyrant who came to power in a military coup. He turned Havana into a luxury playground for foreigners, while keeping Cubans mired in poverty and killing thousands in police crackdowns. Even President Kennedy called it the worst example of economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation in the world.
Yeah, basically.
Whatever Batista's faults, it can't compare to the totalitarian nightmare Castro would create. Forced labor camps, torture of prisoners, no freedom to speak or to leave.
Forced labor camps, like basically any American prison. Please read your own 13th Amendment. Forced labor camps were operational for only 3 years, and basically set up for people who were opposed to military service, which was mandatory at the time. Basically, in the Cuban government's perspective, it was your way of doing your duty to your country while not doing active military service. They were also for active and violent criminals, which is fair. There were many injustices as part of it, as with any system anywhere, but unlike in most countries, Cuba has actively apologized for their existence, and Castro himself later on considered it to have been a wrong thing to set up, with active efforts by the Cuban government to correct those injustices. Be very wary when you read anything about the UMAPs, though, as they're known in Spanish, because the vast majority of info on them is basically Miami Gusano bullshit with no basis in reality. Literally, Stalin ate all the grain and Lenin ate babies level of nonsense. Torture of prisoners is actually very hard to find real info on, and the actual likelihood is that very little of that, if any, happened. A lot of torture does actually happen in Cuba, though, but only in the American-occupied Guantanamo Bay camp system, carried out by our good old friend Uncle Sam. Freedom of speech is a meme, you don't really have it anywhere, and if you want an actually educated political perspective on it, then read Lenin's letter to Myasnikov. Cubans were allowed to leave Cuba, they just had to get there on their own, which again isn't very different from anywhere else. Immigration from Cuba was actively encouraged by the US for political propaganda reasons. Meanwhile, Haitians fleeing the Duvalier government were sent back or not allowed entry. You still see this nonsense to this day.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come.
But this isn't the trial of Fidel Castro, is it? Che Guevara was instrumental in helping Castro seize power. As a commander in his guerrilla army, he unleashed a reign of terror across the countryside, killing any suspected spies or dissenters.
This is a lovely point because the reality is so painfully clear it's actually funny. Bad Empanada made a video on this, but a quick rundown. The people executed by Guevara after a trial were known bandits, rapists, murderers who would attack peasants, known torturers of peasants, and police also known for, you guessed it, torture of civilians. As for the executions after the revolution, well, I'll just show a clip from the Bad Empanada video.
But what about the charge of him being the butcher of La Cabaña, as he's known amongst many Cuban Americans? What happened there? Well, there were trials held there for criminals of the Batista dictatorship. There were two separate tribunals, one which only tried civilians and one which tried military and policemen accused of war crimes. These were compared to the Nuremberg trials due to the severity of the crimes of the dictatorship. According to Anderson, several hundred people were tried and executed there in what he describes as above-board, if summary affairs, with defense lawyers, witnesses, prosecutors, and an attending public. So hardly the random executions of innocent people as they're often portrayed as.
He also helped peasants build health clinics and schools, taught them to read, and even recited poetry to them. His harsh discipline was necessary against a much stronger enemy who didn't hesitate to burn entire villages suspected of aiding the rebels.
Very correct. I remember an account of a Batista officer being fascinated by the rudimentary form of dual power built in the countryside by the rebels and peasants. Entire communities with schools, health clinics, bomb shelters, and even power plants. He, of course, burned them all down afterwards. The Batista forces made it blatantly clear that they were not on the peasants' side. This episode is actually recreated in the first Che movie, which I highly recommend checking out.
Let's not forget that the new regime held mass executions and killed hundreds of people without trial as soon as they took power in 1959.
completely dishonest, refer to the Bad Empanada video. There were trials, which were official and boring affairs to standardize something that otherwise would have occurred in the streets by massive groups of angry people wanting to get revenge on people who imprisoned, tortured, and disappeared civilians. It always amazes me how these types will cry blood trying to defend the absolute worst examples of humanity just because they were anti-communist.
The executed were officials and collaborators who had tormented the masses under Batista. The people supported this revolutionary justice.
My point exactly.
Which people? An angry mob crying for blood does not a democracy make. And that's not even mentioning the forced labor camps, arbitrary arrests, and repression of LGBT people that continued long after the revolution. There's a reason people kept risking their lives to flee, often with nothing but the clothes on their backs.
Again, playing defense for the worst examples of humanity. The only quote-unquote people this very real person in your life somewhere cares about are the dictator's lackeys and landowners with literal slaves, it seems. You see this exact same stuff with the Free Tibet crowd, honestly. We already discussed the prisons where people did agricultural work that again lasted only 3 years, unlike the still ongoing nearly 1 million people in forced labor camps in the US. The arbitrary arrests point is one that you can't really make in good faith regarding Cuba, especially as an American voice. Read the new Jim Crow to understand actual arbitrary arrests. The LGBT point, again, is the same exact meme. This isn't whataboutism, which isn't a real thing, by the way. This is simply pointing to the grandest hypocrisy that they'll mention this, but not even blink an eye at what goes on within the US every single day. The Cuban LGBT movement speaks for itself, really, and if you've been following Cuban news at least a little bit in the past 25 years, you'd realize that this is a moot point. Also wondering why people would immigrate from a third world country to the richest country on earth, which is like 80 miles away, is so immensely stupid it's ridiculous. This isn't a socialism versus capitalism thing, nor is it a Cuban system versus American system thing. Had Cuba not had a crippling embargo placed onto it for the past half century, then it would have been leagues ahead in every sphere of development, and what's interesting is, even with the embargo, Cuba still beats out the US in literacy rate, infant mortality, access to healthcare and education, life expectancy, etc., etc. That same embargo has been condemned by every single country on earth at the UN, except for the US, Israel, and recently Ukraine. How lovely. By the way, the embargo isn't mentioned once in this entire video. Interesting, huh?
So was that all this Che brought to Cuba? Just another violent dictatorship? Not at all. He oversaw land redistribution, helped establish universal education, and organized volunteer literacy brigades that raised Cuba's literacy rate to 96%, still one of the highest in the world.
Yes, actual real things people care about. Insert the Parenti reading clip here.
Prostitution used to be one of the biggest industries. And today, this man is going to night school. He said, I can read. I can read. Do you know what it means to be able to read? Do you know what it means to be able not to read?
Which allowed the government to control what information everyone received. Guevara's idealistic incompetence as finance minister caused massive drops in productivity when he replaced worker pay raises with moral certificates. He suppressed all press freedom, declaring that newspapers were instruments of the oligarchy, and it was he who urged Castro to host Soviet nuclear weapons, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis that brought the world to the brink of destruction.
Oh boy, the take of the century. People should remain illiterate, otherwise they'll become communists. Again, what world does this guy live on? Doesn't the capitalist state and the capitalist class control literally all media in the US? I'm just wondering what the angle is. You know what the angle is. Cuba's crime is that it dared to become an independent country and not a prostitute, drug, and gambling den for rich white American tourists. For that, they've been punished for the last 60 years. The finance minister point is so silly it's actually funny. I don't want to drag this video out too long, but check out Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution by Helen Yaffe if you're interested in the details. The press freedom point is equally nonsense. There's no press freedom in the US, and this has been established for decades. Check out Manufacturing Consent or Parenti's own Inventing Realities for details. Soviet weapons in Cuba were a logical reaction to Americans putting nuclear weapons in Turkey. This was a reaction, not a provocation. If anyone needed to be blamed, it's the US, which, need I remind you, tried to invade and illegally overthrow the Cuban government in the Bay of Pigs invasion.
He was a leader, not a bureaucrat. That's why he eventually left to spread the revolution abroad.
That he did, and there were several theoretical mistakes made related to that which led to his death. Regardless, his example would inspire countless millions later on, so this sacrifice wasn't in vain. From South Africa to Vietnam and Palestine, Guevara's ideas and image are monumental, and outside the brain rot of American conservatives, is considered to be an international hero. My own country's valiant resistance against the illegal American aggression during the Iraq War was equally inspired by Guevara, just like resistance movements everywhere.
Which didn't go well. He failed to rally rebels in the Congo and went to Bolivia even when the Soviets disapproved. The Bolivian government, with the help of the CIA, was able to capture and neutralize this terrorist in 1967, before he could do much damage.
Why does it matter to this guy the Soviets approved? Also, the charged language just makes me laugh. Before he could do much damage, my guy, the modern Bolivian government and people consider him a hero, and the CIA is still trying to overthrow the progressive forces in the country, which were inspired by his example.
While doing plenty of damage themselves in the process. So that was the end of it? Not at all. As Che said, the revolution is immortal. He was publicly mourned in cities all over the world.
Yep, a man of incomparable achievement, genuinely. As Fidel said, Guevara was like a rose that was cut before it was allowed to bloom.
Not by the Cubans who managed to escape.
And what kind of Cubans were those, I wonder why that question is never asked. Spoiler alert, it's because the most vocal voices on that front are former white massive landowners with, as mentioned previously, literal slaves. Either that or people directly related to the dictatorship. Unsurprising that they wouldn't like the government that took their privilege away. Those not of that background have reasons far more complex than Guevara bad.
And his story would inspire young activists for generations to come. Ha! A trendy symbol of rebellion for those who never had to live under his regime.
Lamau, some of the most ardent pro-Guevara people are Cubans themselves. What is this guy talking about?
Symbols of revolution may become commodified, but the idea of a more just world remains. Maybe, but I'm not sharing my coffee. Che Guevara was captured and executed by government forces in Bolivia. His remains would not be found for another 30 years. But did he die a hero, or had he already become a villain? And should revolutions be judged by their ideals or their outcomes? These are the questions we face when we put history on trial.
And it's over. Some very liberal sounding questions in the end aside, the video is pretty decent. If you're interested in Guevara's life, I've made plenty of recommendations in my book recommendations playlist. Anderson's Che Revolutionary Life, though, is absolutely the best, in my opinion. Give it a read, and do the same with his many diaries. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help.